Biomechanics of an overhead squat with a barbell. It is important to note that the overhead squat is a screening tool used to assess functional mobility of the hips and knees. Let's start with the squat. This toddler is the poster child for a perfect squat. Notice the head and trunk position. The weight is on his heels and his knees are tracking over but not beyond his toes. There are many joints and movements used to perform an overhead squat with a barbell. Let's start at the top and work our way down. The shoulders are abducted, flexed, and slightly externally rotated. The lumbar spine is in neutral to slight extension and stabilized. The hip and knee joints move into extension during the ascent with the hips in slight external rotation, and then they move into flexion during the descent. The ankle joint moves from plantar flexion on the ascent to dorsiflexion on the descent. The wrist, elbow, and fingers are stabilized to hold the weight overhead. Now that we've talked about the movement that is necessary for this exercise, let's talk about the muscles that need to be activated. The upper body and core need to stabilize the weight overhead. The synergistic muscle activation of the deltoid, rhomboids, latissimus dorsi, trapezius, triceps, finger flexors, and wrist extensors serves to stabilize the barbell. The core maintains proper alignment of the lumbar spine to prevent injury through the isometric contraction of the rectus abdominis, erector spinae, obliques, and the transverse abdominis. The hamstrings and gluteus maximus activate eccentrically during the descent to control the movement. The quadriceps contract eccentrically, flexing the knee. The ankle dorsiflexes via the eccentric contraction of the gastrocnemius. Now let's look at the upward phase. The upper body and core muscle activation during the upward phase is the same as during the downward phase. The hamstrings, gluteus maximus, and quadriceps activate concentrically to extend the hips and knees. The ankle joint plantar flexes via concentric contraction of the gastrocnemius. Every movement has a position, velocity, and acceleration. There are two classifications of joint movement that apply to the overhead squat. Linear or translatory motion is demonstrated when the body moving from standing to squat and reverse. Rotational movement is demonstrated at the shoulder joint as the barbell is being lifted up, and at the hip and knee during squat to stand and reverse. Let's consider the angular displacement when moving from standing to squatting. There is a certain amount of movement you need in order to execute a squat. For example, being able to transition from 0 degrees of dorsiflexion in standing to 35 degrees of dorsiflexion at the bottom of the squat will positively affect your ability to perform the move safely. The angles identified here represent the individual's full range of motion for an overhead squat. Load, position, or change in lever length would have a direct effect on the angular rotation of each respective joint. For example, placing a platform under the individual's heels would create a longer floor-to-knee joint relationship in comparison to a foot flat on the floor. That platform offers a more vertical tibia position, which allows increased flexion of the knee and hip joint due to the shift of the center of mass. This position decreases torque on the knee while simultaneously increases torque on the hip joint. We now know that changes in load, position, and lever length impact angular rotation. What impacts velocity and speed during an overhead lift with the barbell? Research shows that speed in which the bar moves is impacted by the weight or load. In a study, they report that the bar speed for heavy loads ranges from 0.2 to 0.4 meters per second, and the bar speed for lighter loads ranges from 0.6 to 0.8 meter per second. This is important to know because in order to make an exercise meaningful, you must supply the just right level of resistance to maintain good form and provide a challenge. And then there's form. These two pictures are examples of what to do and what not to do. The lifter on the left has shifted his barbell too far behind him. The ground force is anterior to the force of the weight coming down. To complete the lift from this position would require compensation in the shoulder, which would cause injury. The lifter on the right has lined up the force going up with the force coming down, so that when she stands, the force will go directly up and no compensation will be needed to be made elsewhere in her body. As with all exercise, there is a right way and a wrong way to perform them. The next few slides will be dedicated to form. The bar should be resting on the upper trapezius at the start, and the wrist should be extended. The starting position for the elbow should always be under the shoulder. When you go to dip and drive to push the bar over your head, you should move straight up and avoid hinging at the hips, as this will prevent back injury. Once the bar is over your head, it should be balanced over your midfoot. Medial knee displacement is a common issue observed during an overhead squat. During the overhead squat, force is directed down through the barbell, and if it is not met with equal force upward, an alignment displacement occurs. This can be avoided by tracking the knees over the toes in a sagittal plane and maintaining proper foot position. Once down in the squat, it would behoove you to do a quick check of alignment. As you transition to standing, the hips and the chest should rise at the same rate so that the bar doesn't go forward and cause you to drop the weight. As you can see by the lifter on the right, it's so easy a child can do it. Surely Newton must have a movement equation for the overhead squat. May the mass times acceleration be with you. Of course it's Newton's second law. Let's see if we can break this down. On picture 1, mass in this case is the lifter and the weight, and they are constant. In this second picture, the lifter applies a force to the weight while simultaneously changing his position in a linear motion to accelerate the bar over his head. Acceleration of the bar occurs because the force is greater than the weight. In the third picture, all subsequent squats will need to maintain a greater force upward than the weight of the bar to keep it overhead. The body powering up and down is acceleration. Thank you, Sir Newton. This concludes our presentation. Don't you just love science?